It was a crisp autumn morning in Milan when everything changed. Alessandro Romano sat in his modern glass-walled office, surrounded by sketches of his upcoming spring collection. The wall behind his desk displayed magazine covers featuring his work, a testament to 15 years of building his fashion empire from scratch. His fingers moved swiftly across his iPad, reviewing fabric swatches from suppliers, when a notification pinged. A new email. He almost ignored it, busy with preparations for Milan Fashion Week, but something made him pause. The sender's name made his coffee-steadied hands tremble. Elena Rossi. 15 years. 15 years since he'd seen that name anywhere except in old photographs he'd tucked away in a box he never opened. His ex-wife. The woman who'd disappeared from his life just as his career was taking off. The subject line was blank. Alessandro's finger hovered over the email for several seconds before he finally tapped it open. There was no message, just an attachment. His first instinct was to delete it. Their divorce had been messy enough. What could she possibly want now? But curiosity won out. The photo loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, like time itself was trying to prepare him for what he was about to see. And then there it was, a school portrait of a teenage boy, maybe 14 or 15 years old. Alessandro's coffee mug slipped from his hand, spilling across his desk and onto his latest sketches, but he didn't even notice. The boy in the photo had his eyes, not just similar, they were exactly his eyes, right down to the unusual golden flecks in the left iris that his mother used to call stars in amber. The boy had Elena's nose, her supple smile, but everything else was like looking at his own high school photos. Below the image, just 2 lines of text. Heat your son. We're landing at Malpensa Airport tomorrow. Flight AR 1424 from Buenos Aires, 2:15 p.m. Alessandro read the words over and over, his mind refusing to process them. A son? How could he have a son he never knew about? But as the initial shock began to fade, the math started adding up in his head. Elena had left 15 years ago, disappeared without warning, leaving only divorce papers with her lawyer. She must have been pregnant when she left. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the wall. His assistant, Lucia, poked her head in, concerned by the noise. "Everything okay, Mr. Romano?" He stared at her, trying to form words. How could everything be okay? His entire world had just shifted on its axis. Cancel everything tomorrow afternoon, he managed to say. "But sir, you have the meeting with the fabric suppliers from Florence and the interview with Vogue Italia." "Cancel it all." His voice was firmer now. "Family emergency." Family. The word felt strange on his tongue. For years, his fashion house had been his only family. He'd thrown himself into his work after Elena left, turning their small boutique into an international brand. Fashion weeks in Paris, New York, London, Milan, celebrity clients, magazine covers. He'd achieved everything he ever dreamed of, but standing there, staring at the photo of a boy who had his eyes, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Alessandro spent the night pacing his penthouse apartment, his mind racing with questions. Why had Elena kept this secret? Why tell him now? What was he supposed to say to a teenage son he never knew existed? He pulled out the old box of photographs he'd hidden away, studying Elena's face in their wedding photos, trying to see if there had been any signs, any hints of what was to come. He remembered their last fight like it was yesterday. He'd been working late again, preparing for their first major fashion show. Elena had accused him of caring more about his designs than their marriage. He'd fired back that at least his designs didn't try to change who he was. They'd both said things they couldn't take back. The next day, she was gone. Morning came, and Alessandro found himself standing in front of his closet, something he'd done thousands of times before. But today, for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to wear. What does one wear to meet their teenage son for the first time? Everything in his carefully curated wardrobe suddenly seemed too flashy, too formal, too wrong. He finally settled on a simple black sweater and jeans, the kind of outfit he wore when sketching designs at home, when he didn't have to be the famous fashion designer everyone expected him to be. Today, he just needed to be himself. Whoever that was. The drive to Malpensa Airport felt both endless and too short. His driver, Roberto, kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, clearly concerned by his unusual silence. Alessandro's phone buzzed continuously with messages from his team about the upcoming fashion week, but he couldn't focus on any of it. As they approached the airport, his mind wandered to all the possibilities ahead. Would his son hate him for not being there? Would he understand that Alessandro hadn't known about him? Did he inherit more than just his eyes? Did he share Alessandro's passion for design, his love of art, his terrible singing voice that Elena used to tease him about? The airport arrival board showed flight AR 1424 was on time. Alessandro stood in the waiting area, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Around him, families reunited with warm embraces, business people hurried past with rolling suitcases, but he remained frozen, his eyes fixed on the doors where international passengers emerged. Then his phone pinged again. Another email from Elena. "We've landed. He's wearing a blue denim jacket." Alessandro's world narrowed to those doors, watching as passengers streamed through. An elderly couple, a group of students, a family with small children, and then a tall, lanky teenager in a denim jacket appeared, pulling a red suitcase. He had Alessandro's height, his walk, and those eyes, those unmistakable eyes. Behind him walked Elena, looking somehow both exactly the same and completely different from his memories. The boy, his son, glanced around the arrival area, and for a moment their eyes met across the crowded terminal. In that instant, Alessandro realized that regardless of what happened next, his life would never be the same. The distance between them seemed to stretch for miles, though it was only a few meters. Alessandro took one step forward, then another, 15 years of unknown fatherhood weighing on each movement. His son stood still, watching him approach, wearing an expression that mixed curiosity with something else. Was it hope? Fear? Anger? Alessandro stopped a few feet away, his carefully prepared words evaporating like morning mist. All he could do was look at this boy. This stranger who was also, undeniably, his flesh and blood. The moment stretched between them, filled with 15 years of absence and a lifetime of possibilities. And then the boy spoke, his voice carrying a slight Argentine accent. "Sir, you're my father." Those 4 words changed everything. 16 years earlier, Milan sparkled under a summer sunset. Alessandro sat in their small apartment above their boutique, sketching designs by lamplight, while Elena developed photographs in their makeshift darkroom, once their spare bathroom. They were young, in love, and full of dreams. He wanted to revolutionize Italian fashion. She wanted to capture the world through her lens. The memory of that last summer played like an old film in Alessandro's mind. Their tiny shop had just caught the eye of a major fashion magazine editor. His designs were finally getting noticed, and everything seemed possible. But success, as they would learn, had a price. "You missed dinner again," Elena had said one evening, her voice tired. She stood in the doorway of his workshop, still wearing her camera around her neck. The pasta she'd made sat cold on the kitchen table, 2 candles burned down to stubs. "I'm sorry, love. This collection has to be perfect. You understand, right?" He hadn't even looked up from his sketches. If he had, he might have noticed the way she pressed her hand against her stomach, might have seen the tears she quickly wiped away. The boutique was becoming busier, his name starting to buzz in Milan's fashion circles. Late nights turned into early mornings. Elena's photography exhibitions went unattended. Their shared dreams began to drift apart like boats losing their moorings. "Remember when we used to walk through the city at midnight?" Elena had asked one morning, watching him rush to get dressed for another meeting. "You'd point out the architecture that inspired your designs, and I'd photograph the way the streetlights painted shadows on the walls." "We can do that again soon," he promised, kissing her cheek. "Just let me get through this season." But this season became the next season and the next. Their small boutique grew into a proper atelier. Alessandro hired his first employees. Elena's darkroom gathered dust, her cameras sitting untouched on shelves. The fighting started small, missed dinners, forgotten anniversaries, competing career dreams. Then came the bigger arguments. About money. About time. About the future. About children. "I want a family," Elena had said one night, her voice barely a whisper in their bedroom. "We will," Alessandro had replied, already half asleep, "when things settle down." But things never settled down. His first major fashion show was approaching, and he was drowning in preparations. Elena tried to help, but he pushed her away, insisting he needed to do this himself. He didn't notice how she'd stopped drinking wine at dinner, how she'd been different lately, quieter, more distant. The final night came during a thunderstorm. Alessandro had just received word that several major buyers would attend his show. He was elated, working late again, when Elena appeared in his studio. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Do what?" "Elena, I'm busy. Can we talk about this later?" That's the problem. It's always later, 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 but later never comes. He'd finally looked up then, really looked at her for the first time in months. She seemed different somehow, but he couldn't put his finger on what had changed. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, frustration building. "I'm doing this for us, for our future." "Our future?" Elena had laughed, but it wasn't her usual warm laugh. "There is no us anymore, Alessandro. You live in your world of fashion and I need to find my own way. You're being dramatic. Once the show is over, I'll be gone by morning." He hadn't believed her. How could he? They were Alessandro and Elena, the dreamer and his muse, the designer and his photographer. They were supposed to conquer Milan together. But when he'd finally come home the next evening, she was gone. Her cameras, her clothes, her photographs, all gone. Only a manila envelope remained on their bed, containing divorce papers and a note. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He tried to find her, of course. Called her friends, her family. No one knew where she'd gone, or if they did, they wouldn't tell him. After a while, he stopped asking. Threw himself into his work. Turned his pain into creativity, his loss into drive. His fashion show was a triumph. Buyers fought over his designs. Magazine covers followed. The small boutique became a brand. The brand became an empire. He moved out of the apartment above the shop into a sleek penthouse. Success filled his days, but his nights remained empty. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd wonder where she was, what she was doing. Was she still taking photographs? Had she found happiness? But he never imagined, never dreamed, that she was raising their child in a city across the ocean. Now, standing in his office staring at the photo of a boy with his eyes, Alessandro understood. All those little changes he'd missed, all the signs he'd been too busy to see. Elena had been trying to tell him about the baby, but he'd been too absorbed in his work to listen. He picked up his phone, opened his photo gallery, scrolled back through the years until he found it, the last picture they'd taken together. They were standing in front of their boutique, young and smiling, his arm around her waist, her camera in her hands. He zoomed in on her face, saw the glow he'd been too blind to notice then. A knock at his office door startled him from his thoughts. His assistant entered with fabric samples for tomorrow's meeting, the meeting he'd just cancelled. "Sir? Are you sure you want to cancel everything tomorrow? The suppliers have come all the way from Florence." Alessandro looked at the photo of his son again, then back at the old picture of Elena. 15 years of choices, of priorities, of putting work first, flashed through his mind. "Yes," he said firmly. "Some things are more important than fashion." His assistant's eyebrows shot up. In 15 years, she'd never heard him say anything was more important than fashion. But she simply nodded and left him alone with his thoughts, with his memories, with the weight of 15 years of unknowing fatherhood pressing down on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would meet his son. Tomorrow, he would face Elena again. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, he sat in his quiet office, surrounded by the empire he built, wondering if the price of success had been higher than he'd ever imagined. The airport terminal buzzed with activity, but Alessandro barely noticed the crowds. His entire focus was on the teenage boy standing before him, wearing the blue denim jacket exactly as Elena had described. Time seemed to freeze as father and son faced each other for the first time. "So, you're my father." The words hung in the air between them. Alessandro's throat felt dry. "Yes," he managed to say. I just found out about you yesterday." Elena stepped forward, her presence both familiar and strange. She looked different from his memories, her dark hair shorter now, streaked with elegant silver at the temples, her photographer's eyes sharp as ever behind stylish glasses. "This is Leo," she said softly. "He's 14. Leo. His son had a name. Of course he had a name. He'd had 14 years of life that Alessandro knew nothing about. 14 years of birthdays, first steps, first words, school days, scraped knees, and childhood dreams, all lost to him. "It's good to meet you, Leo," Alessandro said, trying to keep his voice steady. He noticed Leo carried a sketchbook under his arm, its edges worn from frequent use. The sight made his heart skip a beat. The boy nodded, studying Alessandro with an intensity that reminded him of Elena's way of looking through her camera lens, as if trying to capture every detail of a moment. "Your eyes," Leo said suddenly. "Mom always said I got them from my father." "I used to think she was just saying that, but that are exactly the same," Elena finished, her voice soft with memory. An announcement echoed through the terminal, breaking the moment. Around them, life continued as normal. Travelers rushing past with rolling suitcases, families embracing, business people checking their phones. But for these three people, the world had shifted on its axis. Would you like to get something to eat?" Alessandro offered, gesturing toward the airport cafes. "Unless you're tired from the flight." "Food would be good," Elena answered, looking at Leo, who nodded. "The airline food was terrible, wasn't it, Mio?" The Spanish term of endearment hit Alessandro like a gentle punch to the gut. Of course, his son had grown up in Argentina. He probably spoke Spanish as his first language. Another detail of Leo's life he knew nothing about. They found a quiet cafe in a corner of the terminal. Alessandro noticed how Leo moved with a kind of casual grace, despite his teenage lankiness. He ordered his coffee in perfect Italian, though with a slight Argentine accent that made it sound almost musical. "You speak Italian well," Alessandro commented as they sat down. "Mom made sure I learned it," Leo replied. "She said it was part of my heritage." He paused, then added, "I also speak Spanish and English." "Leo's good with languages," Elena said, a note of pride in her voice. "And art. He's always drawing." She trailed off, perhaps realizing she was stepping into sensitive territory. Alessandro's eyes went to the sketchbook again. Leo noticed and pulled it closer to himself, almost protectively. "May I?" Alessandro asked gently, gesturing to the book. There was a moment of hesitation, then Leo slowly pushed the sketchbook across the table. Alessandro opened it with trembling fingers, and his breath caught in his throat. Page after page of clothing designs, each one detailed and innovative, showing a natural talent that made his heart ache with recognition. These are incredible," he said honestly, turning each page with growing amazement. "The way you've structured these lines, the flow of the fabric, you have a real eye for this." A tiny smile tugged at Leo's lips, the first Alessandro had seen. "I know who you are," he said. "I've seen your designs in magazines. Mom has a whole collection of them." Alessandro looked up at Elena, surprised. She shrugged slightly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I thought he should know about his father's work," she said. "When he started showing interest in fashion design, I knew it was time to tell you both the truth." "How long have you been drawing?" Alessandro asked Leo, still captivated by the sketches. "Always, I guess, but seriously, about 2 years." Leo hesitated, then added, "There's this design competition in Buenos Aires next month. For young designers. I entered it." Pride swelled in Alessandro's chest, followed immediately by sadness. His son was following in his footsteps, and he hadn't been there to guide him. A comfortable silence fell over the table as their food arrived. Alessandro watched Leo eat, noticing little things. How he held his fork the same way Alessandro did. How he absently sketched on his napkin between bites, just as Alessandro had done at his age. "Where are you staying?" he finally asked, looking at Elena. "We booked a hotel in the city center," she replied. "We're here for 2 weeks. I thought that would give us all some time to figure things out." 2 weeks. How do you compress 14 years of fatherhood into 2 weeks? "I have an extra apartment," Alessandro said quickly, "near my penthouse. It's furnished, comfortable. You could stay there instead of a hotel. If you want to, of course." Elena and Leo exchanged a look, having one of those silent conversations that parents and children develop over years of being together. Another thing Alessandro had missed. "That would be nice," Leo said finally. "As long as it's okay with Mom." Elena nodded slowly. "Thank you, Alessandro. That's very kind. As they gathered their things to leave, Leo suddenly turned to Alessandro. Do you still have your old sketchbooks from when you were starting out? Could I see them sometime? The question, so simple yet so loaded with meaning, made Alessandro's heart swell. I have all of them, he said. Every single one. They're in my studio. Would you like to see them today? Leo's eyes lit up, and for a moment, he looked less like a guarded teenager and more like an excited child. Really? Really, Alessandro confirmed. He looked at Elena. If that's okay. She smiled, and for a second, he saw the young woman he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. Of course it's okay. He's your son too, Alessandro. As they walked toward the airport exit together, Alessandro felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the kind of hope that came with a successful fashion show or a magazine cover, but something deeper, more personal. His driver was waiting outside with the car. As he helped load their luggage, Alessandro watched Leo take in the luxury vehicle with wide eyes. It struck him then, he had so much to share with his son, but even more to learn about him. The meal and afternoon sun caught Leo's eyes as he looked up at the sky, and those familiar golden flecks sparkled. Alessandro remembered his mother's words about stars in amber and realized that while he couldn't get back the years he'd lost, he could make sure he didn't miss a single moment going forward. The first week of getting to know Leo was filled with awkward silences and cautious conversations. Alessandro had arranged for Elena and Leo to stay in his guest apartment, a spacious place just 2 floors below his penthouse. The proximity felt both comforting and terrifying. One morning, Alessandro heard a gentle knock on his studio door. Leo stood there, sketchbook in hand, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Mom said you're usually up early, Leo said, his voice quiet. I couldn't sleep. I was wondering if maybe, could you show me how you work? Alessandro's heart leaped. Of course. Come in. The studio was Alessandro's sanctuary, walls covered with inspiration boards and works in progress. Morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating rolls of fabric and mannequins draped with half-finished designs. Leo's eyes widened as he took it all in. This is amazing, he breathed, running his fingers lightly over a bolt of silk. Would you like to see how we start a design? Alessandro asked, pulling out a fresh sketch pad. Leo nodded eagerly, settling onto a stool beside his father's work table. Alessandro began to draw, explaining each line, each curve, the way fabric would fall, how different materials would affect the final piece. See how the shoulder line creates a flow? He demonstrated. It's like water running down. Down a mountain, Leo finished, already sketching his own version, like when the snow melts in the Andes. Alessandro paused, another reminder that his son had grown up in a completely different world. You've seen the Andes? Mom and I used to go hiking there, Leo said, focused on his drawing. She'd take photographs, and I'd sketch the landscapes. Sometimes I'd imagine turning the mountain shapes into dresses. As they worked side by side, the awkwardness began to melt away. Leo showed Alessandro his own designs, explaining how living in Buenos Aires had influenced his style, the bold colors of La Boca, the dramatic lines of tango dancers, the mix of old-world elegance and modern energy. This one, Leo said, pointing to a sketch, was inspired by the jacaranda trees when they bloom. The way the purple flowers fall. I thought it could be like layers of chiffon. Alessandro studied the design, impressed by his son's eye for detail. This is really good. Have you ever tried making any of your designs? Leo shook his head. I don't know how. I mean, I can sew a little. Mom taught me basics on her old machine, but nothing like this. Would you like to learn? The hope in Leo's eyes was answer enough. Over the next few hours, Alessandro taught him how to select fabric, how to create a proper pattern, how to understand the way different materials would behave. Elena found them there around lunchtime, both so absorbed in their work they hadn't noticed the time passing. She stood in the doorway watching them, her camera hanging around her neck like always. You two missed breakfast, she said softly, not wanting to interrupt the moment. They looked up, surprised. Alessandro saw her raise her camera slightly, capturing the scene. Father and son surrounded by sketches and fabric, their matching eyes bright with shared passion. Sorry, Mom, Leo said, but he was smiling. Dad was showing me how to make patterns. It was the first time Leo had called him Dad instead of Alessandro. The word hung in the air like a delicate thread connecting past to present. "Your father's patterns were always perfect," Elena said, coming into the studio. "Even back when we had that tiny shop, he'd spend hours getting every detail right. You remember that?" Alessandro asked, surprised she'd mentioned their past. "Of course. You used to drive me crazy, measuring and remeasuring until midnight." Her voice held no bitterness now, just a gentle nostalgia. Leah looked between them curiously. What was the shop like? Alessandro and Elena exchanged glances, years of shared memories passing between them. "It was small," Elena began, "above a cafe on Via Monte Napoleone, but it had the best light," Alessandro added. "Perfect for your mother's photographs." "You took pictures of his designs?" Leo asked Elena. "She was my first photographer," Alessandro said softly. "Her images helped build my brand." Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through old photos she'd kept. "Look, here's the shop window from our first collection." They gathered around the phone, looking at images of a much younger Alessandro and Elena standing proudly in front of their tiny boutique. Leo studied the photos intently. "You look happy," he said simply. The observation hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. Why did it end? How did everything change? But neither Alessandro nor Elena had simple answers. Elena said finally. "We just lost our way somewhere." "But maybe," Alessandro added carefully, "some paths can be found again. Different paths, but still connected." Leo nodded, understanding more than they realized. "Like in design," he said, "sometimes you have to unravel something to make it better." The wisdom in his words struck them both. This 14-year-old boy, who had every right to be angry at them both, was instead trying to weave their broken threads into something new. "Are you hungry?" Alessandro asked, changing the subject. "We could order lunch, continue working on that pattern." "Actually," Leo said, "could we go out? I'd like to see the old shop, if it's still there." Elena and Alessandro looked at each other, surprised by the request. "It's a big designer boutique now," Alessandro said, "but the building's still the same." "Perfect," Leo said, gathering his sketchbook. "Maybe we could walk there. Mom always says you can't really know a city until you walk its streets." As they left the studio together, Alessandro noticed Elena discreetly wiping her eyes. He understood why. Their son was somehow helping them rebuild bridges they thought had burned long ago. The Milan streets were busy with lunchtime crowds, but they walked slowly, pointing out landmarks to Leo. Alessandro showed him buildings that had inspired past collections, while Elena took photos of father and son examining window displays together. They were creating new memories while revisiting old ones, and somewhere in between, they were finding their way forward as a family, different from what they'd originally planned, but perhaps exactly what they all needed. As days turned into weeks, Leo spent more time in Alessandro's studio, absorbing everything he could learn about fashion design. His natural talent bloomed under his father's guidance, and the awkwardness between them gradually melted into an easy companionship. One evening, while working late on a design, Leo looked up from his sketchbook. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Alessandro still felt a warm glow every time Leo called him Dad. "Of course. Would it be okay if I used your sewing machine to make something? I have this design I've been working on." "You don't need to ask. Everything here is yours to use." Alessandro paused, watching his son's expression. "What are you planning to make?" Leo pulled out a sketch from his book. The design was stunning. A modern take on a classic Italian suit with subtle details that showed both Alessandro's influence and Leo's unique style. "It's beautiful," Alessandro said truthfully. "But a suit is complicated for a first project. Maybe we should start with something simpler." "Actually," Leo said, his voice growing quiet, "I've already started it. Mom's been helping me practice sewing at night. I wanted to surprise you." Alessandro felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Show me." Leo led him to the guest apartment. In the spare room, a half-finished suit hung on a mannequin. The stitching wasn't perfect, but the attention to detail was remarkable for someone so young. "The competition I mentioned," Leo said, fidgeting with his sleeve. "The one in Buenos Aires? It's in 3 weeks. I thought maybe, if I could finish this." "You want to enter this piece?" Alessandro asked, examining the careful craftsmanship. Leo nodded. Unless you think it's not good enough. Not good enough. Leo, this is exceptional, especially for someone your age. Alessandro touched the fabric gently. We'll help you finish it. Together. Over the next few days, they worked side by side. Alessandro taught Leo the finer points of tailoring, while Elena documented their progress with her camera. The apartment filled with the sound of sewing machines, quiet conversations, and occasional laughter. One afternoon, Elena found them debating the best way to attach the suit's lining. You two missed lunch again, she said, setting down bags of takeout. I brought pasta from that place around the corner. Sorry, Mom. We got caught up in the details. Leo was bent over the sewing machine, his forehead creased in concentration. Like father, like son, Elena murmured, snapping a photo of them. The words made Alessandro look up. Elena was watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read, pride mixed with something else. Sadness? Regret? You should take a break, she told Leo. Food's getting cold. As they ate, Leo talked excitedly about the competition. There's going to be judges from fashion schools all over South America, maybe even some European designers. I could come, Alessandro said suddenly. Both Leo and Elena looked at him in surprise. To Buenos Aires for the competition, if you want me there. Leo's face lit up. Really? You'd do that? Of course. I wouldn't miss it. He glanced at Elena. If it's okay with your mother. Elena smiled softly. I think it would mean a lot to Leo. Later that evening, after Leo had gone to bed, Elena found Alessandro still in the studio, looking at old photographs. He's so talented, Alessandro said without looking up. All these years, he was developing this gift, and I had no idea. Elena sat down beside him. I should have told you sooner. I was just afraid. Afraid of what? That you'd be too busy. That fashion would still come first. She took a deep breath. That you wouldn't want to be part of his life. Alessandro set down the photos. I've missed so much, Elena. His first steps, his first words, his first drawing. But you're here now, she said gently. And look how quickly you two connected. He talks about you constantly. Shows me every new technique you teach him. He's amazing, Alessandro said. Not just his talent, but his heart. After everything, he just accepted me. Children have a capacity for love that we sometimes forget as adults, Elena replied. They can see past our mistakes if we let them. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the city lights twinkling beyond the studio windows. I've been thinking, Alessandro said finally. After the competition, maybe we could figure out a way for Leo to spend more time here. He could study design, learn the business. Only if he wants to, of course. Elena nodded slowly. He'd like that. But his life is also in Buenos Aires. His friends, his school. We could make it work. Summer breaks, holidays. I could come there sometimes too. Alessandro looked at her earnestly. I want to be part of his life, Elena. Really part of it. I know, she said softly. That's why I finally told you about him. I saw how passionate he was about design, how much he admired your work. He deserved to know his father. And you deserved to know him. A noise from the doorway made them both turn. Leo stood there in his pajamas, holding his sketchbook. I had an idea for the suit's collar, he said, then paused, looking between them. Is everything okay? Everything's perfect, Elena assured him. Show us your idea. As Leo excitedly explained his design concept, Alessandro watched him with wonder. This boy, with his creative mind and gentle spirit, had somehow bridged the gap between past and present, helping heal old wounds without even trying. The suit was more than just a competition piece now. It was becoming a symbol of their reconnection, each stitch bringing them closer together as a family. Different from before, but perhaps stronger for having been broken and carefully mended. Like the finest designs, they were creating something new from fragments of the past, and the pattern was turning out more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. The morning of the fashion show arrived with a buzz of nervous energy. Alessandro's latest collection was set to debut, but his mind wasn't on his own designs. Leo's suit hung perfectly pressed in his office, ready to be shipped to Buenos Aires for the competition. I want to enter it in today's show, Leo announced at breakfast, making both his parents look up in surprise. the fashion show. Today, Alessandro set down his coffee cup. Leo, that's a major industry event. The press will be there, buyers from all over Europe. I know, Leo said quietly. That's why I want to do it, to prove I'm really your son. The words hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Elena reached for Leo's hand across the table. Mio, you don't have to prove anything, she said softly. You're his son, no matter what. But people are talking, Leo persisted. I heard your assistant on the phone yesterday, Dad. She was telling someone about the secret son who suddenly appeared. Like I'm some kind of scandal. Alessandro felt a flash of anger, not at Leo, but at the gossip that had inevitably started circulating in the fashion world. He tried to keep Leo's arrival quiet, to give them time to bond without media attention, but Milan's fashion circle was small and news traveled fast. Let them talk, Alessandro said firmly. Their opinions don't matter. But my design does, Leo insisted. If it's good enough to be in your show, they'll have to accept me. Please, Dad. I need to do this. Alessandro looked at Elena, who gave a slight nod. It's his choice, she said. And the suit is ready. All right, Alessandro agreed. But are you sure you want this kind of pressure? The competition in Buenos Aires is one thing, but this? I'm sure, Leo said, his chin lifting with determination. I want to show them what a Romano can do. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Alessandro called his team, rearranging the show's lineup to include Leo's suit. Elena helped Leo make final adjustments while documenting everything with her camera. As the models began arriving for their fittings, Leo watched in fascination. Alessandro noticed him sketching quick studies of their movements, already thinking like a designer. Your suit will be the final, Alessandro told him. The last piece of the show. That's usually where we put the strongest design. Leo's eyes widened. Really? But what about your evening gown? The one with the crystal beading? It'll close the first half, Alessandro said firmly. Today, you're the star. As they worked, Alessandro noticed Elena wiping tears away several times. When he caught her eye, she smiled shakily. He's just so much like you, she whispered. The way he focuses, how he sees things others don't. I should have known keeping you two apart was impossible. The venue was packed by showtime. Fashion critics, journalists, and industry leaders filled the front rows. Alessandro peeked through the curtains, his stomach tight with anxiety, not for his collection, but for his son. Is it always this crowded? Leo asked, appearing beside him. Usually, but don't think about them. Focus on your design. It's beautiful, and it deserves to be here. The show began. Alessandro's collection received the usual appreciative murmurs and applause, but as he stood backstage with Leo, watching the models walk, he barely noticed his own designs. Finally, it was time for the final. Leo's suit appeared on the runway, worn by a young male model who carried himself with elegant confidence. The audience fell silent for a moment, then began to whisper. They're trying to figure out who designed it, Alessandro explained quietly to Leo. It's clearly influenced by my style, but they can tell it's something different, something new. The whispers grew louder as the model reached the end of the runway. Alessandro could hear people asking questions, flipping through their programs, looking for information. That's when Leo stepped out from backstage. Without saying a word, he walked to the end of the runway and stood beside his design. The whispers turned to gasps of recognition. The young designer was clearly Alessandro's son, their resemblance unmistakable in the bright lights. Elena appeared on Leo's other side, her camera capturing the moment. The three of them stood together, a family united by creativity and courage, facing the fashion world as one. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo. Fashion critics were on their feet, photographers' flashes creating a storm of light. But Leo wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his parents, his eyes shining with pride and love. Backstage, after the show, journalists clamored for interviews. But Alessandro held up his hand, stopping them. Today isn't about me, he announced. It's about new talent, fresh perspectives, and the future of fashion. My son Leo designed the final piece you saw today. And yes, he is my son. Not a secret, not a scandal, but a gifted young designer who deserves to be recognized for his work, not his name. The reporters turned to Leo, who stood straight and answered their questions with a poise that made both his parents proud. Yes, he was also entering the design competition in Buenos Aires. Yes, he hoped to study fashion formally one day. No, he hadn't known about his father until recently, but they were making up for lost time. And what about your mother? One journalist asked Elena. How does it feel to see your son following in his father's footsteps? Elena smiled, her camera still in her hands. It feels right. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, but it leads us where we're meant to be. Later that evening, as they celebrated in Alessandro's penthouse, Leah received a call from the competition organizers in Buenos Aires. They'd seen videos of the fashion show online, and they wanted to feature his suit in a special showcase of young talent. See? Alessandro said, hugging his son. You didn't need to prove anything. Your work speaks for itself. But I'm glad I did it, Leah replied. Now everyone knows who I am. Not just Alessandro Romano's secret son, but a designer in my own right. Elena watched them, her camera capturing one last image of father and son silhouetted against the Milan skyline. The photo would later hang in Alessandro's studio, a reminder that some designs, like families, take time to perfect, but are worth every stitch along the way. 3 months after the fashion show that changed everything, Alessandro stood in the arrivals area of Buenos Aires International Airport. His heart raced with anticipation as he watched passengers stream through the gates. This time, he wasn't the one waiting to meet someone, he was the one arriving. Leo and Elena had returned home 2 months ago, but they'd worked out a plan. Alessandro would spend 1 week each month in Buenos Aires, and Leo would come to Milan during school holidays. Dad. Leo's voice carried across the terminal. The boy, looking taller somehow, even after just 2 months, ran toward him, wrapped him in a tight hug. Careful with his suit, Elena called out, laughing as she approached more slowly. He just finished a 14-hour flight. Alessandro hugged his son back, not caring about wrinkles. I missed you both, he said simply. The drive from the airport showed him glimpses of Leo's world. The colorful buildings, the tree-lined streets, the mix of old and new architecture that had inspired his son's designs. Elena had kept their old apartment, a beautiful space filled with her photographs and Leo's sketches. Your room is ready, she told Alessandro, showing him to the guest bedroom. Leo insisted on setting it up as a mini studio, so you can work while you're here. The room had a small drafting table by the window, and the walls were covered with fashion magazines featuring Alessandro's work. He recognized Elena's touch in the carefully arranged space. The competition is tomorrow, Leo said, hovering in the doorway. Are you nervous? Because I'm really nervous. Alessandro smiled. A little, but mostly excited. Your design already won over Milan's toughest critics. Buenos Aires will love it. That evening, they sat on the apartment's balcony, sharing mate, a local tea tradition Leo insisted his father had to learn. The city sprawled before them, lights twinkling in the early evening sky. I've been thinking, Alessandro said carefully, about the future, about us. Elena and Leo looked at him expectantly. What if we tried something new? Not going back to how things were, but creating something better. He pulled out his tablet, showing them architectural drawings. I'm opening a new design studio here in Buenos Aires, a sister location to the Milan house. Leo's eyes widened. Here, really? Really. I'll split my time between both cities. We can work together, develop your talent. And when you're ready for design school, you can choose Milan or Buenos Aires. Elena touched his arm gently. You'd do that? Move part of your life here. I've missed too much already, Alessandro said softly. I don't want to miss any more. The next morning, the competition venue buzzed with excitement. Young designers from all over South America showcased their work, but Leo's suit, now famous from the Milan show, drew special attention. As they waited for the judge's decision, Alessandro watched his son talking animation with other young designers, switching effortlessly between Spanish, Italian, and English. Elena captured everything with her camera, just as she always had. He's grown so much, she said, standing beside Alessandro. Not just in design, but as a person. Having you in his life, it's made such a difference. Having him in my life has made all the difference, Alessandro replied. And having you back in it too, Elena. Not like before, but better, she finished. We're better as friends, as parents, than we ever were as husband and wife. The announcement of winners brought them back to the present. When Leo's name was called for first place, the audience erupted in applause. But Leo didn't run to accept his award immediately. Instead, he hugged both his parents first. "We did it," he whispered. "All of us together." Later that night, they celebrated at a local restaurant. Leo couldn't stop talking about the judges' comments, the other designers he'd met, his ideas for future collections. "Slow down," Elena laughed. "You have time. Years to develop your style." "And we'll be here to help," Alessandro added. "Both of us." As they walked home through the warm Buenos Aires night, Alessandro reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The void in his life that success could never fill had been replaced by something precious: family. His phone buzzed with messages from Milan. The fashion house needed decisions about the upcoming collection. But for once, Alessandro didn't feel torn between work and family. Instead, he showed the messages to Leo. "What do you think about these fabric choices?" he asked his son. "Want to help me decide?" Leo's face lit up as he studied the swatches on the phone screen. They spent the rest of the walk discussing colors and textures, while Elena snapped photos of their animated conversation. Back at the apartment, Leo pulled out his sketchbook. "I have some ideas for the new studio," he said excitedly. "Since it's going to be in Buenos Aires, maybe we could incorporate local elements into the design?" Alessandro and Elena exchanged smiles as their son outlined his vision, a perfect blend of Italian elegance and Argentine passion, just like Leo himself. "You know," Elena said softly, "sometimes the best designs come from mending what's broken, from taking the pieces and creating something new." Alessandro looked at his son, now deep in concentration over his sketches, and at Elena, still capturing moments with her camera, and knew she was right. Their family hadn't been destroyed 15 years ago, it had just been waiting to be redesigned into something stronger, something better. "The future looks beautiful," he said, and for the first time in years, he wasn't talking about fashion. Leo looked up from his sketching. "Can we start on the studio tomorrow? I want to show you all my favorite places in the city, Dad. The places that inspire me." "We have all the time in the world," Alessandro assured him. And as the Buenos Aires night wrapped around them like soft fabric, he knew that finally, after all these years, they were creating their masterpiece, not of silk and thread, but of love and forgiveness, of second chances and new beginnings.